Good evening, everyone. My name is Mohammed El-Gamal, and tonight we're actually conducting a special session to go over the expectations of the exam, how it's changed, perhaps over its last iteration, and take some questions from folks regarding just general prep, using School of PE and moving forward, poster classes and things of that nature. Before we actually begin, I just want to be able to, just a few housekeepings. We do expect quite a large group. Right now, we're about at a steady 130 and growing. There's about 300 supposed to be in attendance. So in the meantime, I would just say be mindful of the chat usage. There will be an opportunity to engage and ask questions. So unless prompted, I would just reserve that for those opportunities. And we do have enough ample time. The content that I have to present should not take too long, but hopefully we can use whatever remainder and rollover to address any concerns moving out. I'd also like to just highlight for any technical issues or difficulties, Martin from the office and also Colin will be in attendance. So anyone that's having technical difficulties, please call our number as well, which has just been posted, 614, starting in 614. And then in the event that I am disconnected for any reason, I just ask that everyone is patient while I reconnect. I think just have to be agile and in the event. Okay. So with that said, the main objective for tonight is to not only go over what does computer-based testing mean for the exam, but to just address general exam expectations. There is a lot of baggage when it comes to the PE exam for a lot of reasons. I think we all look at it as a milestone, kind of like this implied mandatory milestone that we all have to achieve if we're working in the civil engineering industry and space. And more often than not, we do associate it with, our professional and technical acumen. And I think that's probably one of the biggest baggages that we want to be able to unpack and contextualize. So with that said, what I'd like to do is just go over tonight's agenda. And then hopefully we have some points that maybe we want to highlight from what's being covered. And if it's not being covered tonight, we can definitely open it up towards questions at the end. And throughout the presentation, I will ask and I will prompt folks to, if there's any gaps or maybe there's a nuance that they like to offer or inquire about, I think that would be the time. I also want to share a poll. I think this would be a good opportunity to figure out what the makeup of our group is. So what I'm going to do is it's a 2-question poll. So everyone that's with me at the moment, essentially the questions is centered around, is this your first exam attempt? And if it's not, is this your first time with School of PE? And then how many years of professional experience have you attained to this point post-degree? Okay, so anyone that's just joining us, we are at the moment just conducting a 2-question poll. And I think this is going to serve as a great baseline for some of the discussions and perhaps metrics that really guide success on this exam. Okay, and understandably, just for context, I do believe that we are representing perhaps all the time zones across the country. This is a standardized national exam that's even offered internationally as well. So we may even have some folks abroad. But nonetheless, there is diversity in this pool. There's always diversity in this pool. So just being appreciative of that. But the biggest hallmark that we want to be able to say is that diversity aside, I think we have to appreciate the perspective of the examiners and how do they define, the expectations for the exam. So that's what we're going to start with. Everything that hopefully will serve as a talking point can be tracked or derived from what the examiners have to say about these points. So it seems like we've reached our terminal response. Let's see if the results, share the results. So 65% of the group, over 100 folks on today's call right now at the moment. This is their first time attempt. 20%, maybe roughly even, and the remaining, let's say under 40%, are split between repeat takers, first time with School of PE, and repeat takers without School of PE. Maybe it was a previous time, maybe they self-studied, maybe they were with another institution. That's all this, that's very fair. The way that we approach this exam, I think there's different advice for both of these camps. Obviously, there's a lot of overlap, but for repeat takers, there's some misconceptions that we want to also address. And how many years of professional experience post-degree? We see the majority, 55% in that 3 to 5 range, which in my opinion, and we'll come to learn, is perhaps a good indicator. And for everyone else around that or outside of it, fear not. I think we just want to be able to approach it with a little bit more context or a little bit more nuance because of what the examiners are building into this exam. Okay, especially our most tenured and our senior folks with the 10 plus years of experience. I think there's something that we want to unpack from that experience as well. Okay, so in terms of tonight's agenda, again, we said we're going to start off with general exam expectations. We'll talk about the transition from paper and pencil to CBT, what has now been distilled in that experience from the preparation side and from the exam execution side. We'll review at a high level the exam specifications. Has the scoring process changed at all? And what does that look like on this end of things? What are some best practices for exam preparation? Now, we're discussing all of this at the outset of our journey with School of PE. Maybe we started with this on demand. Maybe we started with some of the quiz portals and things of that nature. But for the most part, we haven't taken any courses yet or lectures, at least for the first time takers. So what does that look like, without that context of knowing what's to come in the preparation? We'll discuss the strategies for repeat takers. What are the current exam resources that I would suggest are centered around for our preparation? What are the references that we can use or suggested? This is a topic that I cover exhaustively through the application of problems, but I'll touch upon it briefly. I think it's a valuable one. What is most nearly, if anyone recalls any of the questions in the practice exam, at least the quantifiable ones, not the conceptual ones, they may end off with what is, this answer most nearly. And I think there's something to be said with this terminology. We'll talk about what are some NCES resources that we can peruse and review after the completion of this session. And then we'll open forum it for just questions, anything that we haven't covered in these previous sections. Okay. And for anyone joining us or, using dialed in either on the phone, I am sharing my screen. Okay. So how do the examiners define the principles and practice of engineering, the PE exam? They say it tests for a minimum level of competency in a particular engineering discipline. It is designed for engineers who have gained a minimum of 4 years post-college work experience in their chosen engineering discipline. Okay, this is straight from the website. So a few operative words that I've bolded there and that we'll revisit on the subsequent slides. But effectively, this is the threshold test for competency. They designed this exam and they're telling us that it's for this particular testing group because the state boards, even though this is maybe a national administered exam, the state boards have determined that we have the correct balance of professional exposure and appreciation for theory-based academics from our undergraduate experience to be able to demonstrate, our technical acumen, so to speak. Okay, so that's the definition. And some of the stats, this is as of December 2021, and this represents the last paper and pencil version of the PE Civil exam. So we see, a low of 53 in the construction to a high of 67 in water, resources, and environmental. Historically, I've seen it fall within the range of a high 48 or a low of 48 all the way to a high of mid 70s, maybe 76, 77. I've seen that in transportation structural over the years. Certainly the way that I believe, the gap year that we had due to the offset from the pandemic and the way that people have been able to carve out time for this has definitely changed significantly. And I think our numbers just generally have taken a hit. Perhaps for a lot of reasons, but these are not these are not hitting our potentials essentially in terms of pass rates. But generally, just for context, they usually fall within this range of a 50 to a 70 in the pass rate range for the first time takers. And then we see perhaps more of a significant than we'd like to see repeat takers, a drop from, the 30 all the way to a 44 in this group. School of PE, I think we're proud of this, to tout a pass rate of 90%. I proudly wear that, I'm a product of School of PE as a student and perhaps approaching my instructorship with a little bit, of empathy, of what's actually required to get to the finish line. So hopefully some of that insight, we can share and discuss as well. And then these are just the deltas from that baseline. Okay, we're going to come back to this slide. For now, this is also some data that I've pulled from NCEES. It's a compilation of effectively their publication that summarizes all their data over the years. They publish it on typically a 4, maybe to 6 year gap in this one, or actually 8 year gap in this one. They've advanced their release. Historically, I believe it's been an 8 year collection of data, and then they'll issue it. It's called Squared. You can find all the previous iterations of it. I think because they're also transitioning to a CBT, the data sources are probably not going to be one-to-ones, not apples to apples anymore. So they released it in 2020. And one of the interesting charts is plotting effectively pass rates versus years of experience and the volume of said candidates. So I guess my question to the group, and feel free to drop it in the chat, statistically, where do we see the highest pass rate indicated in red? So this red line that we see right here, that red line correlates to which of the variables? So there's 3 parameters on this graph. The highest pass rate, the peak pass rate, correlates to which variable? Well, we don't know necessarily. So this is all first-time takers only, right? But it's the years of experience, and more the demographic that we're looking at is actually the 4-year testing group right there. So maybe we say it's 74 or 73%, 74% pass rate for the 4-year testing group. The blue represents the volume. So we have the largest testing pool in the 5-year group of years of experience in this 2014 to 2020. But ultimately, they're pretty transparent when they tell us, hey, we've designed this for the minimum 4 years post-college work experience. And that's what we see here, that it yields the highest, statistically, the highest pass rate correlates with the 4-year testing group. I think this is an important thing to acknowledge. And like I said, maybe this balances the right mixture of exposure to industry and a certain appreciation for the academics that goes into this, right? Because if we looked at this exam through the litmus test of what would I do at work, I think that's where we kind of diverge from the true to form expectations of the exam. This is a multiple choice exam. For lack of a better description, it's binary in its reporting. And we don't approach our work that way. I think that's something that I'm going to stress on later on when we're talking about preparation, is that if someone said there's only absolutes in our work, deliverables, we would say that there's no appreciation for economies of scale or the scale of efficiency or engineering design. It's not proportionate to how much cost or investment or quality that you want to invest. Maybe it's a client ask or request, desire, whatever the case is. But that's not necessarily the nuance that we will find on the exam. On the exam, it's usually certain inputs and a very explicit output. Okay, so to further this point, the irony, the deafening irony to this, some of the statistics that you'll see here, is that at 0 years of experience, folks that have no professional experience, postgraduate degree, they may end up in the 68% pass rate versus the people with the most experience in our industry. Our tenured professionals, they may end up in the 53% pass rate. So we're talking about effectively, a 15% delta statistically, that people with 0 years of experience are able to attain this licensure or the status or just passing the exam than folks that have maintained more years in industry delivering, client needs or keeping our infrastructure in a state of good repair. So that's a little from a practitioner, for lack of a better word. This is ironic in its simplest form, and I think this is more telling of the nature of the exam rather than our professional abilities. Okay. So for folks that are in the 11 or 10 plus year category, what we have to do is recalibrate that when we're approaching problems, when we're approaching solutions, the litmus test or the lens that we approach these things is not, the final litmus test isn't how would I do this at work? And I think that speaks, through is what are the examiners seeking to establish competency, right? Being overly conservative is maybe something an acceptable practice at work, so we don't underrun a budget, or rather overrun a budget. But it's not something that's expected on this exam. Exam is calibrated from a psychometric perspective, which we'll talk about what that means downstream. Okay. Any questions on this? Any thoughts that anyone wants to? I just thought this was very important because, for what it's worth, I think I had the baggage when I went into the exam process, and I was just like, yeah, once I get this, that's it. Like, I'm going to be this full-fledged engineer. It's going to be, demonstrative of my ability, et cetera, et cetera. And then you pass the exam and you kind of feel a little bit different because maybe you have imposter syndrome. You're like, all of a sudden I have to be this competent person, and I don't necessarily feel like that. And then as you spend more time in the industry, you realize it's a function of your experience. It's a function of your exposure. Your battle scars of staying in the industry and the craft. It seems like every state will let you take the exam before student. Well, before the trend that we saw, and so Billy's asking a question regarding now the states easing restrictions in terms of being admitted to take the exam. This was something that was constant in other states. So we're talking about on the national spectrum, how many states, I couldn't tell you the exact breakdown, but there was a good group of individuals that were still admitted to take the exam, but their license wouldn't be activated until they hit those 4 years of experience. So independent of whatever the state board allows you to take the exam, they still wouldn't issue the license until you hit those 4 years of experience. Years out of school in practice. Hasu. So that correlates to years of experience post receipt of your undergraduate degree in practice. Ideally, it's a combination of progressive design experience and professional experience. That's what we want to see, a healthy mix, because obviously not all of us are centered in a design producing role, but we should be familiar in the expectations of what the license not only represents, but what the examiners also expect that the candidates are able to demonstrate their competency through. Similar per discipline? No, this would be the civil. This would be the. I have to check, but I believe this is across the board for the PE. It's a good question. Something that I'll definitely look into to see if they've ever clarified it by testing group. Okay. What we do have, at least, per discipline, is the pass rates that they've been, historically been updating. And because of the fact, I will say, and I'll add to this maybe later on, it's a very large group, so it's very well distributed. So we'll see those statistical norms kind of play out in terms of standard distribution and things like that. Okay, on to item number 2, which is what does the paper and pencil transition to CBT actually look like? Instead of being offered twice a year, I think this is a plus category for us, that it's offered year round via the specific Pearson VUE test centers. I think to this point, the only thing that I want to stress, and I'll stress when we're talking about preparation, is that because there's latitude in terms of electing when to take the exam, we saw this uptick with the FE going to CBT, which was essentially, life events happen. We're adults. We're going through the motions of priorities, and the exam may not fall higher on that list because of something that takes precedence, and that's absolutely fair. And so it gets adjourned, and then it gets adjourned, and then it gets into perhaps a few legitimate to we're leaning into the concessions more than we should, and then 6 months delay turns into a few years, and then we could end up. I think I remember hearing of a candidate for the FE exam that paid for the rescheduling 7 times, within a few year time frame. So these things, I think we just want to be able to establish some discipline. We want to strike the iron while it's hot, and commit to that timeline that we establish on the onset. Okay, now that it's offered year round at these testing centers, and essentially not, a huge congregation of folks in a recreational hall or a YMCA or a university campus auditorium, we have to adhere by the expectations of how Pearson conducts their test centers in conjunction with what the examiners have outlined in their requirements or their specifications for exam administration. They are prohibiting food and drink during the examination, which was something that we had, depending on the testing location, you had access to in the traditional paper and pencil. That's not to say you can't bring food with you. You can just put it in your locker, and we'll talk about breaks and things of that nature. But during the actual examination, no food or drink. Earplugs are permitted, and I believe some of these testing locations are equipped with noise canceling headphones. So that is something that we can, if that's something that makes us comfortable now, that's something that we can translate for the exam as well. Essentially, what you're going to be walking into the exam room with is your ID, your calculator. They've specified explicitly in the examinee guide that without the cover. Okay. So if there's equations or any shorthand stuff or programming, just assume that you will not have access to this. The locker key, which you'll store any of your personal effects, your food and your drink can go in your locker. You're allowed to bring your eyeglasses without the case. That's something they also went out of their way of specifying. And any comfort items such as a light sweater or jacket. They did indicate that you're under audio and video surveillance throughout the entire testing duration. So if that, just to note that as well. You will have a reusable booklet. I don't know what this booklet looks like from Pearson VUE, but maybe they have a preview of it in the on their websites. But I assume it's probably some, expo-like board that's that can be wiped down and reused with this marker. So that may affect the way that you approach problems and how you save scratch work. Maybe it's paper-based. If it is paper-based, that allows you to at least organize your work so you can revisit it if you ever moved around. But that's something that they indicated explicitly. I'm pulling these, directly from the examinee guide. So as well. There's a laminated sheet. Okay. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, whiteboard. Okay, great. And I'll go over what it looks like essentially on your screen. There are some video links that I'll be sharing at the end of this, and anything that I'm pulling out, like any of this information, not only will you have access to the recordings, any of the reference documents that I'm discussing will also be hyperlinked for your reference as well to look up. So if you've taken the FE, so it seems like folks that are familiar with the FE process, essentially this is going to translate one-to-one for the PE as well. Okay, what is the format? 80 questions, 2 sections, breadth and depth. One of the changes that I thought was interesting is that in the previous paper and pencil versions, we would finish the morning, and then effectively, once we finish the morning, 4 hours break, then you receive the afternoon booklet, or you would start on the afternoon questions. In this version of CBT, both will be administered at the start of the exam. Essentially, you can start wherever you want. You can jump around. And then the break is a function of how much you actually complete, and which I'll talk about. This is a little ambiguous, and it's not as well defined. So it's a little bit more fluid, and it's based on the candidate progressing through the exam more than it is anything. So we'll talk about this on the next slide for timings. Okay. Most of the questions, this is indicated in the examinee guide, most of the questions will be traditional multiple choice format, which is one correct choice from the 4 that are given to you. But they are integrating, perhaps you've seen it in the FE, what they'll call alternative item types. So multiple correct, meaning more than one can be correct. Point and click, a graphic, maybe indicate where the zero force member is, which allows them to put in essentially more options. There's a drag and drop option as well, which could be matching, sorting, ranking, or labeling, and fill in the blank. And none of these, unfortunately, one of the things that they've indicated is there is no partial credit. It is all going to be essentially binary and point award system. Okay. And Zach has indicated that not allowed to erase any scratch work, and maybe that's the consensus of what that experience looks like for the use of this laminated sheet. Thank you for sharing that. Okay. Perhaps the biggest change of all, call it a blessing or a curse, is that there's no outside references. Effectively, before the traditional experience is people used to have to curate libraries, tabbed and flagged and highlighted, and lug around a big suitcase where they would bring it to the exam. They would organize all their books, and you'd hear everyone flopping around through their binders and huge texts. This is no longer a case, which admittedly makes it easier for us to concentrate our efforts on what we can essentially recall and access during the exam, but it doesn't necessarily give us this, this comfort or this safety net of, okay, this is where I've aggregated all my practice exams. This is where I've aggregated all of my notes. I've curated, these great problems that I think are really relevant for reverse engineering on the exam. Whatever the case is, we don't have that luxury, but I think it also, it's a double-edged sword. So the examiners have to be very explicit with their testable content. What is testable? And I think it puts the onus on them of curating not only a very precise exam specifications, but problems that align with that for the sake of fairness. This might be controversial, but in my estimation, in my professional estimation now as an instructor and my experience as a student, I deem the testable material as it correlates with the exam specifications, quote unquote, fair. I think there's a one-to-one And I think that for the most part, they have to adhere to these expectations that they establish. Otherwise, there is a legal implication to not having a fair assessment of competency, right? Who are they to say that who is competent and not competent if they keep shifting the goalposts? So that goalpost has to be very, very secure, has to be very sound, and it has to be something that the entire nation, if not, outside of the nation, can refer to say, okay, what am I preparing for? How am I preparing for it? So when we see those domains or topics on the exam specification, so project planning, what is a quantity takeoff problem? Do I know what that looks like? Yeah, I know what that looks like. When I take the School of PE refresher course, I know quantity takeoffs refers to material or labor takeoffs for, a diagram or a prompt. And it's just essentially a quantification of a certain element, right? So if I'm looking for a volume, I'm quantifying it and I'm adding some waste factor. I have to be able to make that correlation to that subtopic and say, okay, there's my checkbox. I know this topic, okay? And equally, the examiners have to be able to insert a problem that matches with the topic that they said they will test us on, okay? So no outside references on the exam. However, there's two things that we have. There are the design standards that are offered to us for the depth application, right? So we said there's two components. So there's design standards, or we'll say the design codes, and the reference book. So much like in the FE experience, we had the reference handbook that they used to administer. They used to give us a hard copy, a brand new hard copy, when it was paper and pencil, and then they went to electronic, and that was essentially searchable. So that offered us some, if we knew the keyword, we can easily access it. In this case, we'll only have design standards and the reference handbook, which we'll discuss in detail in the coming slides. Okay. They are currently on version 1.1, released in November 2021. It is searchable, and you can access it, and I hugely recommend that this is downloaded and part of your study compendium now, because this is something that you're going to have during the exam. In the actual exam experience, you're going to have this as a side-by-side view. So maybe that was comparable to what we saw in the FE experience, essentially split screen, and it was on the left side, and then your exam question was on the right side. And you can either browse through it through the index or search through it. And there's also a video that I will point everyone or provide at the end of this so people can actually go through that and see what it looks like. Okay, and then the exam specifications. I also have a dedicated slide to show the changes of the exam specification from the paper and pencil to the CBT version. And we have some questions accumulating, so let me just maybe clear this queue very quickly. Marvin was just indicating that you don't have to satisfy the 4 years, and you should be able to take the exam while you're still, you have more bandwidth early on. And I agree with that. I think we all have a little bit more bandwidth right out of school. I think maybe it's just generating that enthusiasm to really get in there and get in the weeds as early as possible. Nick brings up a very good point. He says, how do we balance any refresher course or material versus using the handbook if there's a departure, right? So if, the School of PE class, for example, we're going to be referencing refresher notes, we're going to be referencing workshop problems, we're going to be referencing the Civil Engineer Review Guide. So that's the text that we published in the last couple of years. And then we're also supposed to be referencing the handbook. At the end of the day, what does it all distill down to? And Nick, if you're in my class, what I will say is, if there is any topics that are going to stress reference to material that's not found in the reference handbook, the NCEES reference handbook, then we have to question the validity or the testable nature of that content, right? So everything has to trace back to it because that's what the examiners are using during the exam. Or number two, it has to be so common that any quote unquote competent examinee should be able to answer it without the use of a reference. much like what is the volume of this shape, or of, how much concrete is needed for this, or maybe the advantage of, I don't want to generalize or say something, misspeak, but it's something that has to be very innocuous and what I would classify under the umbrella of common engineering knowledge. And we'll talk about that maybe during open forum, but I hope that answers your question, at least to start off with now. And I generally teach the construction breadth, so hopefully, we'll be able to revisit this as well in that class. Someone asked, where can we find the design standards for studying depth? Download the exam specifications, which I'll open up in a few slides, and I'd like everyone to have that accessible and handy throughout their entire study process. I mean, this is something that we should be referring to on a weekly basis for sure. Does this mean that design standards will be publicly available and not blocked behind a paywall by Pearson, creating artificial difficulty because the standards are not accessible to all? Zach, great question. And I think that there's definitely some, perhaps in my personal view, perhaps some limitation, because these standards are published by industry organizations, by not NCES, not by Pearson, not by anybody other than those actual organizations. So whether that's ASCE or ACI, they spend their own money, resources in determining and creating these standards that are used across the industry. And they determine a price for them, right? Unfortunately. And I think the history before CBT was we had to acquire them, or we had to be using them at work to some degree. And that was what was leveraged during the actual exam. So it was almost like a transition of like, oh, this is what I use. I have this on my desk because I'm a practicing engineer, and this is relevant for my subject matter expertise in profession, and it translates for my exam application. So it wasn't an issue. Now, there's a little bit more agility or pivoting in terms of the dynamic roles of folks. So they may not use these standards, and they might not have them accessible to them. But then if they want to get this license, they have to pick a discipline and then get all these standards that they may not be using. And I think that's, changes from person to person. But unfortunately, for the most part, a lot of them are on the other side of a paywall. I know some of them are free. Some of the federal standards like OSHA or the MUTCD, downloadable, but other ones are behind strict paywalls. And I'll leave it at that for now. And then if we have specific questions, we can definitely talk about it on a case-by-case basis. Talisa, Brett was asking, they can't provide, next one makes it much harder to prepare. Yeah, so he's just maybe in concurrence with what we were discussing. Joe, is the reference handbook the same for all disciplines? Yes, it is. It's a compendium across the entire spectrum. It's split up by chapters, and we'll talk about that. My opinion about the reference handbook, and I'll pull up some samples of that. A question came up. Can we reference material? Do we have the latitude to open up material during the exam? Yes. To open up the design codes or the reference handbook at any point during the exam? Yes, you will. But the ones that are eligible, in my estimation, the ones that are eligible for your depth, that's what you'll have access to. So they're not going to just throw the entire bookshelf at you and say, hey, this is everything that's needed for water. This is everything that's needed for, it's a good question, but my estimation is that they'll only give you what's needed for your depth. M. Nagra was asking to match what's in the PE reference manual. Will that be during the exam? So every instructor curates their notes, and I'll speak on behalf of what I generally do in my refresher notes. There's at least one slide dedicated to all the associated sections or the index sections that can be found in the reference handbook. So if there is an associated or applicable, chapter, it is brought into that refresher section, so we can make that correlations and we know how it translates. Okay. Okay, so just so we can catch up with these are really great questions. So what I'd like to do is I'm gonna just pin. I think I left it at 7:35. There's a question at 7:35. I'm gonna pick that back up after we, as we go through, and if we've already addressed it. Just so, this is a great discussion, but I think, just addressing it later on, I think would be more conducive because we might be hitting these points organically. So bear with me, everyone. And I appreciate your patience and all the great points that are coming through. Okay, and I think we mentioned about just having the exemplifications and it representing a cornerstone to a successful strategy, just always referencing it. And we'll talk about the actual changes that we see explicitly in there. In terms of timings, your appointment time at Pearson VUE is going to be 9 hours. That's the cap right there. You have an NDA agreement that you read and review for 2 minutes. You have a 2-minute timer for that. The tutorial on how to actually navigate the exam, that's 8 minutes. The exam time is 8 hours, and you have a break for up to 50 minutes. So it's a 50-minute max, okay? This is your scheduled break. And the way that they've integrated this break is effectively when you complete approximately, and when I say complete, it's complete, you review and submit. This is the words that they're using, approximately half of the questions. So when you get through 40 questions or so, maybe a pop-up comes in and says, hey, you're eligible for a break. You're welcome to take it now. It should be noted that you can forego any time from the scheduled break to return to the exam, but it does not transfer to the exam time. Essentially, you can just finish it sooner than your actual, than your actual appointment time. So instead of, finishing in 9 hours of appointments, you can finish in, 8 hours and 30 minutes effectively. Yeah, because if you add all up, everything left of that adds up to 9 hours. Advantage of foregoing time. If you need the break to recharge, absolutely, I recommend it. And I think everyone should be in tune with how they're performing in 8-hour, 9-hour blocks. If someone feels perhaps that, hey, I have the mental bandwidth and time really affects me when I stay in longer into the exam room and I have the energy, I just need a 15-minute recharge, 20-minute cycle. I'm going to do some push-ups, whatever works for you. You're going to go back into the exam room. Then I would suggest that. So it's a person-by-person basis, but effectively, as long as we know, it's a 50-minute max, and you can give up any time if you elect to, but it doesn't transfer to the exam time. You can also take, and I think this is where food comes into play or bathroom breaks, you can take unscheduled breaks at any time, but it will be deducted from your actual exam time. So unscheduled breaks, those are monitored or requested or facilitated through the administrators while they're, watching you doing the exam. And you can take it at any time, but it deducts from whatever exam time. And in the grand scheme of things, I think this is a small transaction for just having, comfort, whatever that comfort looks like, whether it's a water break, a bathroom break, just a snack break. It might not be, I don't know how Pearson is going to allow you to access your locker for those unscheduled breaks, but that's something that maybe we can look into with on a Pearson specific basis. This is just, from the examiner's point of view of what they've indicated. Okay. A few more points in this transition, paper and pencil to CBT transition in the reference handbook. So we talked about this in terms of resources and what to be able to use on the exam and what is this reference handbook actually, how is it used and what does it contain? Effectively, the examiners are saying everything that you need in terms of resource material, NCEES will provide, or anything that you're allowed to use, NCEES will provide. You will not be allowed to bring in anything, and that includes your own personal copy of the actual of this reference handbook. So you can't bring this into a tabbed up version or whatever the case is. No, it's going to be the electronic one that's provided to you on the exam. Okay. Important disclaimer. And I think, for what it's worth, I can give you my own commentary, my own very personal commentary regarding how this reference handbook was prepared and where it stands now versus where it should be in its final form. But what they do say as a disclaimer, it is that it does not contain, maybe it's easier. It does not contain all the information required to answer every question on the exam. So anything maybe that's consisting of theories, conversions, formulas, definitions that examinees are expected to know have not been included. In a previous version, in the 1.0 version, they used this term called common engineering knowledge. I believe that's what it was. And it said, essentially, anything that we deem as common engineering knowledge, something very simple or innocuous, we're not going to put it in. This is not going to be exhaustive. But there is a saving grace to this, right? So effectively, any additional material required for the solution for a particular exam question will be included in the question itself. So when I'm talking about, someone's asking me a question, I get this question often, just like, there's a question on the quiz portal or the practice exam in School of PE that's expecting us to know this equation. And I don't find this equation anywhere, right? My first response is questions can fall into one of two camps. Camp number one is common engineering knowledge. Everybody has to know it. That's considered competent from the perspective of the examiners. Camp number two is that if it's higher level and it requires subject matter expertise, they will do one of two things. They will include it in the question prompt itself, or number two, they will defer to a design standard or a lookup that requires, your reference to that. Okay, so they fall into two camps. There's not this void or this ether space that questions exist that we're going to get curveball on, because then we run into this, this legal issue of fairness for assessing competency from the examiners. So it has to fall into one of these two camps, whether it's so common and that they will establish in a court of law amongst, the state and a federal level that this is the minimum threshold that everybody should know, something very simple. Or if you do need subject matter expertise or reference or code, we're going to tell you that extra information in the prompt and direct you to that, perhaps, if they're nice enough, they'll direct us to the specific section. But they could very well just say, hey, per this standard, what is this answer? And that should be enough to direct us, because we have to be able to use those standards effectively. Okay. So those are the two camps that I'd like to just highlight when we're talking about questions, and that's in the preamble that's in like page 1 or 2 of the reference handbook. Okay. And then there's also Errata that they publish as well. So I recommend just checking that, right before you go into the exam, see if there's anything published in that regard. Again, this is their second release. They released one in October, and then they polished it up and they re-released it in November, right before, they're embarking on this January, Q1, let's call it, for CBT testing. In my humble estimation now, I believe that it is not as comprehensive as what we saw in other texts that we're allowed to bring with us. So if we're talking about, if everyone remembers the CERM, the Civil Engineering Review Manual, or the Civil Engineer Review Guide that's published by School of PE, these are a little bit more comprehensive. Maybe they cover a lot more than what we need, but they were meant to be comprehensive compendiums, encyclopedias that we can refer to that contain theories and all this background supplemental information. The examiners have trimmed out the minimums, or trims out all the superfluous or supplemental material that is not needed, and compiled it in this reference handbook. So I tend to find that it might be a little bit more, definitely distilled. And if I had to just be frank with it, it leans a little bit more on the depth resource than it does on the breadth resource. So it's a little bit more useful at least for the construction stuff. I see it a lot more useful for the afternoon than I do see it for the morning. So I'll leave it at that. And then I'll go back to some of the questions. in the chat, and I appreciate everyone chiming in. So if I can just clear the existing queue, and then I'll invite for more questions, and we could take it from there. I will be going into the exam specifications on the next slide. So Garrett was asking about registering for the exam. Garrett, we can talk about this maybe offline. So I welcome you to email me about your state provisions and when you have to apply and establishing that timeline. But very generally or generically, I'm going to say without caveats, because I think caveats are needed from candidate to candidate, and it changes from person to person and your lifestyle. But a minimum of 2.5 to 3 months of prep time for the exam. And I'm always going to stress quality over quantity. I don't think this is something that should be just, number of hours, 150 or 200 hours. No, it's all about the process, right? Jose was asking about using the reference handbook. This should be integrated in all of our sections. So you should see it at this, in our last iteration of reference or refresher notes. All the School of PE instructors should be, deferring to it. And I think that was also another question as well that it came in. And I understand that School of PE we also have like a robust library of recorded sessions. So it depends on when you catch that session, right? So we did paper and pencil at the fall, and then we also did another one for CBT. So just make sure that we're watching the correct material and that it's most up to date. For the most part, rest assured, it changes very little in terms of content. Content has been pretty much the same, and this is something that we're going to corroborate in the next few minutes via the exam specifications and what the examiners have said are actually on the exam from a content perspective. The only thing that's changed is the modality in reference, right? From having a suitcase full of text to just having one standard book and then any design codes with that. Florjan was asking, what do we do for formulas that are not in Handbook? Like I said, it falls into two camps. It's either common knowledge that we should know, or it's going to be provided to us in the exam. I think it's very important. It puts stress on us that we understand the theories and the concepts of those questions, what they're testing us on, before we embark on being able to solve for that actual, solution. Brett is asking maybe a question that we've unpacked a few times, but this is he articulated it very well. And he said, School of PE equations and the SERM and the reference handbooks, all of these things may present in a slightly different fashion than what we see in the reference handbook. How do we translate this to make it, a one-to-one, an apples to apples experience on the exam day? I'm going to say that everything that we do should be emanating from that reference handbook. And as instructors, all our materials should also be curated to fashion that. And I would, just caveat this and understand that we're in a transition period as well. So whatever material that we see that falls outside of this bounds, I think we just have to make that mental note that if it doesn't fall, one-to-one from the reference handbook, then maybe we don't approach it with the same level of criticality that something appears in the NCEES practice exam, or actually, the way it's spelled out in the reference handbook. I think we just have to take it with a grain of salt and say, okay, this is a relic from a previous version, and it's something that I shouldn't necessarily dedicate as much time to. It's good to know, perhaps, for context, but not necessarily the same, gravity or importance that I would impart for something that I definitely do know is explicitly covered. Some of the questions someone may ask me, if anyone's familiar with this, they're like, hey, we have all these equations for outside perimeter, right? It's the outside perimeter, open parentheses, 2 plus the length of the width, blah, blah, blah. I don't find this equation in the reference handbook. And my response is like, you're absolutely right. It's not in the reference handbook. This is a shorthand method. One of the things, if worse comes to worse, we understand the theory of this question, which is, hey, decompose it into smaller bits, decompose it into length, width of this entire segment, and then add them up all together. You're still going to get there. And rest assured, the examiners we'll time these questions that they can be completed in a reasonable amount of time. It's not going to be burdensome, maybe as what we see in the practice iterations of the refresher notes that might run a little bit longer. So that's, maybe one of the nuances that I'll offer with departures of material from reference handbook to what's presented in the classes. And if anyone has any questions or specific examples that maybe just, they're having a problem digesting, or they just want a second opinion on, you're more than welcome to forward it to me or info at School of PE, and then we can evaluate that and make a publications or an editing update on how that material is presented. But the rest assured, this is something of our highest priority or concern, to be able to make those upgrades. And so we're working towards them if there are any lingering discrepancies. I'd also encourage folks to check the errata. One of the questions as of late that I've been getting for the review guide or the text is, even though it's a published text or a PDF, they haven't re-released the PDF or the published text, so there is errata for that. So just make sure you download it, and you could do that at the front of the jacket using the QR code, or reach out to info at School of PE for more information. Okay. DMCCLAI asked, when they ask a question and if it comes out of a certain manual, etc. So they could direct in the depth. Usually they'll direct us to a specific code. Outside of that, for the morning, it's going to be based off of general engineering knowledge, and that if we do need a reference, it'll be found in the reference handbook. Those are essentially where we draw the line. Reference handbook could be used in both camps, but breadth problems will only reference the reference handbook at a most. Okay. And George was saying, hey, you might do some research sharing with some other folks. Fair. Braden is saying, can you speed up one and then associate it with, can you spend more time proportionately? I think that is one of the advantages that comes out of this. Maybe you finish the morning in 3 hours, and so you have 5 hours now effectively to work towards the afternoon. I think that's a great advantage that emanated from this structure, as opposed to before. It had to be start and ended within 4 hours, and the other one had a start and end of 4 hours. So very, very great point, Braden. I like that. If you only use 30 minutes of the break and then later you need another break, is that 20 minutes left or deducted? So anything that's foregone from the established break time, from the scheduled break, can never come back to you. And anything that you take after that is deducted from the exam time. Okay, and Zach, thank you very much for corroborating. When you finish, once you review and submit the first 40 questions, you're going to get a pop-up. Great. No lockers during the break, Darshell. Very good. Okay. Matt Martin asked, are the questions split up like 1 to 40? Is breadth and depth would be 41 to 80? I would presume so. I find it extremely, extremely hard to believe, and I'm not going to say with absolute in an absolute sense, but to do it any other way would be cruel and unusual, and I think that would fall outside of the consistency that the examiners have established. So for all intents and purposes, I think that's a fair assumption for sure. Marvin, I'll refer to the exam specifications for the. So I'm assuming what's happened is that the examiners will have PDF versions of the design standards. So if design standards are not available in a PDF, I think they've actually made special ones that are searchable by PDF. And those are the ones that are accessible because they're not circulated, and they're okay with making special versions of it. And they've worked it out with these design houses or institutions or standard houses, and we'll have them for the exam searchable as opposed to the way that we find them now, they're locked up and they're protected, and maybe you get a hard copy, but there's no way you can perhaps get a PDF searchable one. How they can provide all the needed codes for the depth section. It'll be available in bookmarked fashion, the same way that the reference handbook is provided, Jimmy. And Angel is speaking to that effect. We'll talk about scoring in a second. So I'm just scrolling through anything that we haven't touched. Pitar was speaking to the scoring exercises, which we'll get to. How do they actually do it? Garv was mentioning, how do you get the reference handbook? You have to go into your NCEES account. That is very, very true. George shared that link. Car was asking, what do we do with old reference material? It's still good to get your mechanics, and we'll talk about preparation, but it can't come with you into the exams. And I think we should not be putting in that that expectation that we'll be able to use it. Okay, so the questions in the comments are adding up, so you're going to have to pardon me. So we have about 30 minutes, and I'd like to get through some of this stuff, and then when we get to the questions, maybe that's when I will clear the queue again. So if you'd like to put it in now, that's fine. If you'd like to wait until we get it to the end, but just pardon me if I have a blind spot at the moment for not being able to get to the questions. We do have 200 people in the chat at the moment, or 200 people in the room, and it's more than likely that we'll cover some of these questions and topics. So exam specifications, huge. This is something that should be printed out on everyone's desk when they're studying and reviewed to on a periodic basis. But effectively, long story short, the exam specifications, what they've issued on all of the disciplines, construction, geotech, structural, transportation, and water resources environmental, is that they have not changed since April 2015 when they were originally published. The only thing that has changed is this range that they've indicated here. So number of questions. Before, it used to be one question, and essentially it was a one-to-one. So more often than not, I'll tell you for project planning, there are 4 subtopics. And here, the number of questions was 4, but they've increased the scale, or the latitude of how many questions they want to be able to pull, to offer them a little bit more dynamic testing nature from examinee to examinee. So, means and methods was 3 prior, and now they said 3 to 5. We can ask 3 to 5. Some of these were not one-to-one. Some of them had more topics than they did have minimums. So if you look at structural mechanics, you have A through J, but it starts off 5 to 8. You have more than 8 topics. So they can only, there's going to be a maximum cap off in terms of what kind of content could be brought in. But this was essentially the only fundamental change, is the number of questions range. But rest assured, our focus should be mastery of these topics, not expecting what kind of questions are going to come through or how many questions could come through. That's, stated. So focus on the type of questions, not the quantity of questions. And I think that will be, the measure of a successful strategy. It's very important that we don't get too deep into the rabbit hole of studying every fringe corner of engineering, which we can do, but we have to be able to articulate them, or correlate them, I should say, to these topics that are listed here. Okay. And in terms of scoring, this has always been, you're going to find a lot of anecdotal guidance on this. And I have also my own 2 cents about this, but, I wouldn't necessarily say it publicly. For lack of a better word, or for all intents and purposes, it's essentially what they'll call a scaled score, and what they'll say represents an examinee's ability and is compared to a minimum ability level for that exam. Again, this is a very large testing group. So that competency threshold is very well distributed. Okay. So if we're familiar with a normal distribution curve, kind of think about it like that. And, what we know about passing and failing on general exams kind of translates to this, but, based off of performance and where that competency threshold is determined by psychometric statistical methods, that scaling or that minimum threshold can change from exam to exam, but it usually ends up in the same kind of range, I would say. But they will disclaim that there is no predetermined percentage of examinees that should pass or fail, and that you'll get it, within 7 to 10 days, which is, far improvement from previously of a minimum of usually 35 days. Okay. And these are some of the linear on-the-fly algorithm. That's how they use to essentially construct the exam for the framework. Okay, I appreciate all the questions. You're more than welcome to add them, and I promise I won't adjourn until we clear the queue. So if anything comes up, we can certainly address it. But I want to talk a little bit about preparation and what are some best practices. Maybe now that we're not centered around twice a year, folks haven't decided on a discipline on what to select for the depth, right? Everyone takes the same 40 questions in the morning, and then in the afternoon something completely differently. So how do you select your discipline? Some people select it based off of their subject matter expertise, what they're doing at work, and that's absolutely fine. And I think there's a natural transition there. Some people select it on something that they're keen on or they're interested about. That's absolutely fine there. I think by and large, my general personal advice is that we're selecting a topic that gives us some sort of comfort. So when we're studying late into the evening or we're tired, it generates a little bit of enthusiasm, that it doesn't feel as tiresome or tedious or arduous of a process because there's some intrinsic tie to this topic, whether that's because we do it at work, whether it's because we got a master's degree in it, whether we just like it and it keeps us more stimulated than something else. That's my best advice for this. And it doesn't necessarily have to be something that you work on. For all intents and purposes, if you asked me, it's pretty hard to get a construction industry professional that actually does the construction engineering that's required in the depth module for that exam. It's so multidisciplinary, and it's actually intensive in terms of its engineering and design application, that this is not something that you see quite often in the quote-unquote construction roles, as inspection or quality assurance or things like that. So there are some natural departures on the exam. I think we just have to be aware of them. And as I said, just selecting a discipline based off of our comfort level, I think is huge. Perhaps one of the most important things, and we talked about it on the onset of this presentation, is that we have to understand where the line of professional practice is and how the examiners are going to assess our competency. This exam is binary. It's reported in multiple choices, or there's only one correct answer. And very seldom do we ever approach an engineering problem without some nuance or some context to change the proportionality of solution. And that's usually a function of cost, time, quality, all of these parameters that we would consider for a deliverable. This is not that. The exam is not that. The exam is this more of an academic exercise. And I know that's a deflating thing to say as a practitioner, but I think we have to recognize where that delineation is for sure. Okay, some other best practices. We want to be able to establish an exam date, whenever that is, but more importantly, commit to it. Establish a timeline. What does our study cycle look like? And how often are we visiting material? Someone can say, as long as I cram it all in a 2-week time frame or a month time frame, that should be sufficient. I checked off all my boxes. Rather, this exercise of successful strategy is centered around building ourselves methodically and through repeat exposure. So it's believe it or not, it has a lot to do with that consistency and seeing that material over and over. That does result in a successful outcome for this exam. And something that I'll speak about, if we happen to reunite in one of the construction breadth modules in my sessions, I'll speak about. And I think a lot of these come to light when we're actually looking at problems and reviewing it. Okay, something that we talked about, two things that I want to release actually right now. Mechanics and endurance. Mechanics and endurance, I think these are cornerstones to a successful exam process. Mechanics is establishing our ability to solve for problems in a prompt manner with confidence, not having any way about it and just being able to plug and chug and know what we're doing. You yield a good solution mechanics when we're exposed to the material, we repeat it, and then we do it often throughout, either the weekly basis or the weekend basis, and we're consistently being, exposed to that material. This is huge. So one of the things that I'll typically ask is, how much are we really pushing the envelope on how much time that we can dedicate on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, and ultimately doing it enough where we're not encumbered or we're not bogged down by how much time we can spend on this. So building up in turns. So what does that mean? We maybe start off with 2-hour sessions. We start off with, and then we build up to 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 hour sessions. But if we're not building up to 8-hour sessions in our last month or last 3 weeks, then how does that translate one-to-one on the exam day when we have a 9-hour appointment time and we have to be able to sit there committedly for 8 hours? And I know that's a daunting thing now, but slowly but surely we build up the endurance. And I think that's something I really, really want to stress as two of the biggest cornerstones for that successful strategy. So let me just put a star on that. Okay. A big thing that I want to also stress is replicating exam settings. So we may come to comfort with a lot of resources, printed material. That's absolutely fine. I recommend that. Whatever gives you comfort. But ultimately knowing that this is going to translate for an exam room setting that literally only has your pen, your paper, or maybe this dry eraser board and a computer screen. So contrary to perhaps maybe something you'll hear otherwise, instead of printing it out, having an electronic version of the reference handbook on your laptop in front of you while you're studying, and using that instead. Because if we build crutches based off of a printed version, we're not going to have that printed version. I think it's important, and something could be said about how we use design codes for the depth, and we could talk about that maybe subsequently offline. But how do we use resources now in preparation? Also, equally as important, are we timing ourselves? Are we holding ourselves accountable for a 6-minute time frame? Are we, holding ourselves to a 4-hour time frame, et cetera, et cetera? What is being done outside of the classroom? I think, and School of PE, as a student, it was great experience to be in front of an instructor and getting live feedback on what is being said, contextualizing the theory, seeing it from an advanced level presentation. That was like the world, right? That was like, this is exactly what I wanted to see. Okay. Am I repeating that process independently, building that confidence and my mechanics offline? Because I can listen to someone until they're blue in the face, but does that do anything for strength building on my end? I think that's equally important, or if not the most of tantamount importance that we want to be able to do. So asking ourselves, what is being done outside of the classroom? This is what builds a successful strategy, having that independence and confidence to translate, our mechanics and what we've learned independently. And just a brief note about repeat takers. If we happen to fall into this camp, please don't be discouraged. I think, emotionally and morally, you're on the right track. We're in School of PE, and I think there's a successful strategy that we can help facilitate for this process. The misnomer that I want to be able to maybe distinguish is that if we got close because of we looked at our summary and our diagnostic and we said, I was just this close, maybe luck of the draw, I go in again, I'll have the control find feature. I'll be able to plug and chug it, and I'll be able to be on the finish line. That could be true for maybe less than 5% of the people that do it. That's fine. But like I said, and if I didn't stress it, the exam is very well distributed, not from only the candidate pool, but from the way that they pool in questions, right? That especially now that they have latitude on how many questions that they poured in, and that every exam is going to be different, they know what the difficulty scale is for this question. And so they'll just repackage it. It'll be a different question testing on the same concept. And if we don't have mastery of that concept, do not expect a different result, post release of the score. So what we have to do in a repeat environment is that we're being a little bit more critical with what we did the first time and recognizing that there are areas of improvement that we have to really, pick up, polish to the nth degree, because just going into it, with the same tool set is not going to yield a different result, generally speaking. And so if anyone has any follow-up questions that affects them, on a case-by-case basis, I would wholly welcome it. I think that's something that, it does change from person to person. And I usually, a conversation or two usually goes a long way in terms of identifying what are those opportunities. Okay. What are the fundamental cornerstone resources and references that I would say make up a successful preparation strategy right now? Exam specifications, and listed in order of priority, exam specifications. We have to know what the examiners are going to test us on, bar none. Like, that's the most important thing. How are we using the reference handbook? Number 2. And knowing how to access it, having familiarity with the presentations, the notations, the equations, the organization from chapter to chapter. I can tell you one of the things that I thought was peculiar is that OSHA subpart P, excavations, which correlates to the subtopic of construction adjacent or impact of construction on adjacent facilities. So I think it's question 137 in the practice exam, whatever the case is. That's a construction question or site development question. That's we cover in the 8th subtopic for the breadth. And that's found in geotechnical because it's soil related. It's not covered in the construction chapter. So just knowing some differences like that can help our familiarity in how we access those things. Or, just knowing the key word. If I'm looking for an OSHA and I only know that it's repeated one, or I know that excavations is probably the key word, or subpart P, looking that up, that could probably be the shortest cut to looking up that provision. The NCEES practice exam is literally, it's on my desk at all times when I'm teaching or when I'm referencing anything. Because someone will ask me, well, this doesn't make any sense, or this is the way, how come it's presented this way? And I'm going to open up the practice exam and I'm going to say, this is the precedent that the examiner set for this topic. And yes, we could be technically right on a finite evaluation, but this is not what they're expecting for the competency threshold. And anyone says differently, fine, we can agree to disagree, but it doesn't align with the expectations of the exam. Okay. So that's one element that we'll talk about. If anyone has any questions, please put them in. And then School P refresher notes and the workshop problems. I think these are good for not only guiding the context and the theories, but also testing us on the workshop problem. Or testing us on the content itself. Now, just because we've went through them once, someone may say, okay, they limit in value now, right? And I would counter that. I would say print them out again or rinse and repeat after you've studied your mistakes and then recomplete them. If you have extra bandwidth or there's areas of improvement that you want to focus on more than others, this is what we can be doing to polish up our mechanics or solution mechanics. So I stress that, even though that may be like, I need diversity of questions, right? That's another misconception that I want to stress. Someone can say, diversity of questions is greater than perhaps the same questions. And I would argue with this. I would say, understanding the core fundamentals allows us to enhance our mechanics. And so rather than saying, I need to see this concept differently, let's make sure that we master the original concepts before moving on to something else or moving on to different questions. Maybe if I can insert like another metaphor, if someone will say, if anyone goes to the gym, good form and repetition of exercises right? That's literally what we can say makes a successful workout regime, or regimen, I should say. So when we're going into, you're repeating your arm or your leg workouts, you're doing it, every day or every other day, or you're running on the treadmill, and someone can question you on that same, so why don't you try out this new machine or this different application? But because we know that the repetition does produce results. And I think the same could be said, contrary to maybe what we perceive on the onset, is the same could be said for our mental exercises. Okay. We have about 10 minutes left. We don't have much else. I just wanted to introduce this, give you the resources, and then we'll go into the questions. But most nearly is, if I had to summarize it, and this is going to make a lot more sense when we get into problems. And I want to stay away from going into examples as much now, because this is not necessarily a technical presentation, but most nearly is centered around context of question, right? What kind of question is it? Is it a question that tests on the design application of a code, right? So let me write that down. Design application or code, or is it just a quantification, a generic or innocuous quantification? So it's either one or two. And why I'm saying context of everything, I need to see what is it actually asking for in the prompt. And maybe a nuanced thing is, what is the answer spread? So how are the numbers actually presented? And we could say that the spread of choices drives down the accuracy of reporting. So we calculate something and then we report something. And if those answers that are available to us are very close together, then it tells us that the accuracy reporting has to be much higher, or a calculation has to be a little bit more higher on the accuracy realm. And then ultimately, we want to put that back to the question prompt and say, okay, what kind of context is this? Is this a design application or a code, or is this a quantification of just a parameter? Are we just looking at one parameter? How much is actually there? Not how much do we need to achieve this condition? Okay, so there's two different contexts that we want to be able to remember. And this is excerpted from Civil Engineering Academy. I thought this was a good description. And essentially, the short end of it is, what is the current what is the electrical current or the load on a beam? So it's just saying, how much load do you have on this beam? As opposed to, and that's what I would say is the original quantification, as opposed to the second one, which is, how would you calculate to size a beam or carry that current or carry that load? Or maybe something that involves factor of safety, right? And so typically this would require selecting a value that is closest but larger than the current or the load. Every question changes, this code changes from question to question and from topic to topic. So I can't give us any blanket statements, but this is the closest I can get to try to demystify this concept. And, every instructor may present this a little bit differently, but this is what I summarize from my experience. And I think it's something that we can hopefully carry with us as we unpack this, okay? Some resources, general information on the CBT preparation materials, where we'll find, practice exams. For just context, the exam hasn't changed from 2011, 2014. They released one in 2021, and the questions are all the same. The questions are literally one-to-one. They've changed the presentation. They changed the exam certifications at the front. They changed the way they presented the solutions, but the questions are all the same, maybe with very few, less than one exception. So it tells us that they're not really keen on changing the content more than they are just changing how it's presented, if anything. And that's something that's reiterated to us in the exam certifications. Hey, it hasn't changed since 2015. The examinee guide, a lot of the information that I distilled and pulled from here has been, populated and prepared from the examinee guide. And NCEES has a YouTube channel with these 30 or 40 second blurbs that they're showing us what the exam room looks like. A lot of it was used on, the FE. I don't know if they've re-released any for the PE, but they have a CBT demo, and they also talk about alternative item types as well. Okay, so that's the end of the formal presentation. I understand that we're kind of backlogged on questions, so I'm going to be going through them as fast as possible because I understand that maybe there's some new questions and stuff that we've addressed. So I'll do my best to pick up any questions that haven't been addressed in the lecture, and I'll skip over the ones that we've already touched on. And then anyone that has any new questions, feel free to put them in the chat box, and we'll get to it when I get to it. So right now, just for your context, I'm at timestamp 7:55 in terms of the question log, so I'll be scrolling through at the moment. Someone was asking about handbooks and references in the PDFs. You're going to have that portal with you to be able to access on the left-hand side to be able for any of the questions. So you can cycle between the reference handbook and any code standards if you're doing depth problems. Someone asked, or someone is quoting someone else that's saying, with the new format, they can mix and match these questions at any time. You won't have a clear line of demarcation splitting the exam into AM and PM. You'll get problems as they're fed to you. I do not believe that this is the case. So if there is, I don't think that this is something that the examiners would comment on explicitly, but generically, if we see there is a consistency in the way that the exam specifications are presented and that the way that the exam questions are presented in the practice exam, and that they expect to administer them as well. So there's a one-to-one-to-one. And I have no reason to believe that it's going to be anything other than that. That they may be inclined to group questions together, because if we're talking about, and without belaboring it, the psychometric assessments of examinations, switching the gears on tracks, I'm all for switching questions based off of difficulty, because if we can do things easier up front, then it doesn't matter if it's geotechnical or construction. But from the sake of consistency, they may be more inclined, and I have no reason to believe that they wouldn't consolidate these questions by topic. And maybe someone was, and so this we're talking about content, and I think someone else was maybe alluding to the fact that this is in reference to mix and match of the format. And yes, I would agree with you. They are going to mix and match the format. So what is format? Format is multiple choice, multiple correct, mix and match, fill in the blanks, all those types that we talked about. Okay, Albert was asking, on-demand packages. Alberto, I would just double check with info at School of PE which session that you actually do have, and that do they indicate, just check the timestamps on them, or if there's a date associated with it. So I will tell you, we had a session for paper and pencil in September, October, and then we reran a CBT version in November. Okay, Akilo is also asking about order of subject. Tiffany's also asking about the breaks, and I think we talked about that. Angel is sharing his 2 cents about the morning breath. And I would say, Angel, I'm not too far from you on that. I think the level of difficulty on the morning is comparable to that of what we see in the FE exam. Okay. Is there a sweet, so Maja, pardon me if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, is there a sweet spot in terms of how far in advance we should study prior to studying for the exam? Yes. Yes, I think studying too early in advance you'll run into things like mental burnout and just losing what you've retained from 3-4 months prior. So for most candidates, generically, I recommend 2.5 to 3 months, and where it gets progressively more intensive as you start or go into your study journey. So maybe it starts off with like 2-hour blocks, 3-4 times a week, and then in its final form, you're doing 4-hour, 6-hour sessions. You're doing a few of those a week, and on the weekend, you're doing an 8-hour session. So, but that's, yes, Hasu, is exactly 2.5 to 3 months for most people. When it goes beyond that, then we have to question, what are we doing with our time? Again, this is like kind of striking it while the iron's hot. We don't want to belabor the process, and certainly monitor your mental health in this, not only from like an emotional perspective, but it is very likely that you will be exhausted. And not to dismay or dissuade anybody, but it's something that we want to be able to protect against. So taking breaks when needed to recharge, and if that means taking a rest day or taking every 45 minutes, taking a 15-minute breather, that's fine, as long as that doesn't debilitate us for exam execution on exam day, right? So if that strategy is like, hey, I take a bathroom break every 2.5 hours, if it's to wash my face, put cold water on my neck, whatever the case is, I'm doing that. And that gives me the boost that I need to continue for the next 2 hours. Get into that habit. I think it's all about replicating what we want to be able to do offline. So when we get to exam room, it's a 1-to-1 conversion. Gene and Jim were asking about those codes available in PDF form prior, and you're absolutely correct. It's whatever you can get your hands on now, but NCEES is not going to release them. They have no intention to. It's not in their advantage, nor under their purview. Just like they never provided it in its hard copy form in any iterations prior, they're certainly not going to do them now just because they're PDF. So what can we do for that? In very short fashion, and this is something that you can talk a little bit more intently with, because it changes from discipline to discipline, because the quantity does change quite a bit, and it could be hard to amass 9 books and how to use those books. I think we have to just have a familiarity with them in terms of where everything is located, either index or table of contents, and how it's structured, and then recognize, okay, if this was translated into a PDF format, if I don't have one, I'm not going to have I will have the accessibility of control find features, but I will not have, flags and tabs. So recognizing that, and how do they structure it? Do they put solutions and test problems on the left column, and then they put commentary on the right side, right? So that's a lot of design codes may follow that fashion. Or, if you're using the Federal Register example of the OSHA, I don't advise that. It's not very searchable in that regard. So knowing what text is going to be presented to us and how it's going to be curated could mean savings for resource lookup on the afternoon. So I'll leave it at that for now, but if you have any more specific questions, please drop them in. Have been told that both breadth and depth are fair game to be asked in both AM or PM. There is no delineation, right? So there is no delineation of AM or PM sessions anymore. I think just to hopefully wrap this up, and I don't know if there's any commentary down in the chats currently happening, but effectively, once the door opens, you'll have access to any of the questions, right? I think what we were asking, or what we were discussing, is, are they going to be presented in a systematic fashion? So 1 to 40 is actually morning, and then 40 to 80. I don't think the examiners lose anything by presenting it that way. It's the way they presented everything, and it's the progressive manner of all of the reference material, whether it's the specifications or the practice exam, has been presented. Okay. Has the practice exam been updated per CBT? They've made it a little bit more, there is no updates content-wise. Context-wise, they've polished up some of the solutions, but everything is essentially the same. There's no advantages in the new iteration. Okay. you might see a different cover. You might see the format or the exam specifications, effective beginning 2022. They've updated that range that we talked about, and they changed the numbering. So instead of starting with 101, they start with problem 1, and then they go to 40. And then the afternoon is essentially 41 to 80. And if you ask me, this is consistent with how I believe the actual CBT exam is going to be presented. So they also perhaps integrated those AITs, the alternative item types, as well. But the questions, the content is the same. The context is what changed. Okay. With CBT type questions. Yes, Preston. Yes. Thank you for that. I'm at 8:23 for anyone's context. It says 85 new messages. So bear with me. I apologize that this is taking a little bit longer to clear for the questions, but I will certainly not conclude until we get through any of the discussions. Someone was just making a comment about the School of PE, just as a note, the School of PE does have like other content. So we have the quizzes, we have practice exams, things of that nature. They are going through updates. So I think I'm not as intimately involved, but if anyone has any specific questions about the relevancy or applicability or how it's being presented, feel free to reach out directly to the instructors that cover that topic, or inquire on a case-by-case basis if you see any departures. And Adam, if we can definitely have a conversation. Adam was just asking about his personal experience and maybe some suggestions on his revamp. Reach out to me. We can have a conversation offline, and we can talk about what that strategy looks like come exam time. And Mahmoud is asking, he's a PE mechanical. So I'm just covering the civil related stuff. Honestly, that maybe it's not as civil technical, but this is, I'm speaking about the subject matter. Ultimately, this translates to, it could translate beyond the PE civil, but this was catered or curated for the PE civil. And Nicholas, this is actually being recorded at the moment, so you'll have access to the full presentation and the slides and the resources that we'll go over. So these are as well. So Jacob's asking a question. If you understood correctly, if you finish the first 40 questions in 3 hours, you'll be allowed 5 hours for the depth questions. This is my understanding, and I think that's a great advantage if we can balance the use of our time in this fashion. This was an advantage implicitly that we had on section to section, right? So if we finished 30 questions early in an hour and a half in the first 4 hour time span, that means we had 2.5 hours for the next 10 questions. They've just scaled it up. Instead of being on a 40 question 4 hour basis, it is now an 80 question 8 hour basis. Your break does come when you finish that first 40. So you have the exam timer, the general exam timer start, your scheduled break timer start for 50 minutes, and then you have a maximum of 50. And if you relinquish that, which we've talked about, how that works out. Actually, Molly was asking, you still only get 4 hours for the depth questions if you finish the breadth early. Molly, I would double check that for CBT. If the appointment time runs for, they haven't spoken to that, and I wouldn't assume otherwise if it's not spelled out in the examinee guides. And maybe this is something for another follow-up with the examinees, but the only thing that they've spoken to is that you'll have access to all of the questions for the 8 hours. And when you finish roughly 40 of the questions, your break comes up. It's not tied to a timeline. Someone was asking about class notes be uploaded. So they progressively, because we're going through updates, so expect them in the next few days, whatever your first session is, to be uploaded maybe by the week's end. And then if you'd like to inquire on status, I'm sure someone from the office can definitely facilitate that. Jim is asking about timeline. If he has roughly 3 weeks before the exam, sometimes the sessions may end, 2 weeks before the actual exam. And even though that doesn't afford us like great comfort of knowing those timelines are very close to each other, sometimes it actually lends to our advantage because it's still fresh in our minds. And like I said, the iron is still hot, and hopefully we can translate that one-to-one. And we just have to be really disciplined and organized. A lot can be done in a month's time. And especially in those last 2-3 weeks, it is infinite, in terms of the value gained of honing and sharpening our skill sets. So Garrett was asking about just alignment of on-demand content versus maybe some other content in the classes that he's being exposed to now. Garrett, I would suggest for you and anyone for that matter, if they've started already and they're worried about how this is going to align, I think rest assured the content hasn't changed. And how we go about using that content, I think, should always correlate to the exam specifications and what we see playing out on the exam. So we're going to have to make judgment calls on how to be agile with that information. And if you have any other specific questions on a case-by-case basis, I certainly welcome them, and I'm sure anyone from the office will welcome them as well in terms of how to use that content, as we are all transitioning, right? It's not just School of PE, it's the entire industry is transitioning from paper and pencil to CBT, and what does that look like for us since we are one of the first few testing groups. Someone is asking, how many times can you take the exam throughout the year? There is a cap. I believe it's, someone correct me if I'm wrong. It might be more than 3 times you can take it. Don't quote me on that. I do remember seeing it, and I remember just registering that's probably more than enough than someone would want to take it in a given year. So someone is asking, Timo, once you take a break after those 40 questions, can you go back to those questions on the second half? I think that's a great question. I'll look into it. And if you want to drop in your email, I'll follow up with you. But once you resubmit, I believe they'll probably close it out. I believe they'll probably close out those questions or lock those questions. That's my 2 cents about it without having looked into it. But I think that's a great question to unpack. Molly answered that. You're allowed to leave the test site. So yeah, there it is. Maybe Molly confirmed that. Eric is, can we drop into the School of PE live sessions after the starting time? Yes, you can, but there's attendance polls, and that's what allows you to, the repeat exam process. If you ever fall into that, that's what it's referred to. So just make sure you're getting your attendance polls at least. So maybe that we've achieved a consensus through crowdsourcing the insight is that you can't review or you can't return back to the original 40 after submitting. So there are some course materials. I would, there's no loss in downloading any available information now and starting independently before the class. I recommend that. And, back to that original point is, what are we doing outside of class time? What are we doing outside of the classroom? No one is waiting for us. Like, we can take ownership over the process right now and get the instructor and the live and everything to fill in the gaps once we get there. And it does a lot for just establishing some confidence and taking out the crutches from this process and just owning it, right? So whatever is available to us, I recommend to download it. Okay, so Molly, thank you for bringing that reference. You're not going to have access to those questions. So Timo, that answers your question, hopefully. Where can we find the list of codes that are available during the exam? So back to the exam specifications. So Amy, at the end of your exam specifications, there is a sheet that says the design standards, and every depth changes. So, and it looks like folks were just responding to, you can only take it 3 times a year, in addition to whatever's taken in the reference manual. Yes, that's correct. Once per quarter. Okay, Zach is adding to this. He just maybe clarified from his experience is that you will have the latitude to imbalance your test time on the exam. So if you want to take 5 hours on the first 40 and 3 hours on the last 40, that's fine. But time management is key, and I think this would be a great point to just highlight. We still have quite a bit of groups. I mean, we're done with the formal presentation, so this is just like questions and answering questions. So thank you all that have joined us this evening. What do I have to say about time management? This is something that I stress in the actual technical content or the course that we have for the construction breadth, but I suggest all our examinees to do them in a progressive manner, meaning you start off with the easiest first. And that might require you jumping around a bit, and that might, knock you off, make you feel uneasy because you're just like passing questions and you're just skipping. However, it does allow you for a few things. You earn eligible points as early as possible. You build confidence because you're already locking in points towards the finish line, and that you can proportionally balance time as you progress through the exam. So if I only need 30 seconds for this question and I get a solid point for it, not only do I get to lock in that point, I finish this question, but I can take that remainder 5 minutes and 30 seconds and roll it over to a problem that I know usually takes me 10 minutes to be able to work through and decompose. So those are all the advantages. Now, how do we get comfortable with jumping around? We have to do it during practice. Don't think organically it's just going to come. I think as engineers, we perhaps lean on the more like obsessive side of just like doing things in a progressive manner as they're presented to us and one thing after another. But I would encourage us to try it out. And if we're comfortable with that, it could lead to a more successful strategy. Okay. And Mac is reiterating something that we established is that you won't have access to the previous 41 submitting. It seems like it's but when you finished, you've seen all the 80 questions, you have access to all your return sheet and your answers. Yeah, I'm not necessarily sure, but yeah, I don't know about this particular circumstance, but I'm not too familiar. It's, again, something I can look into and take it from there. FE exam, I guess. Okay, fair enough. I think this is, for what it's worth, a learning process for us all. But thank you for sharing that insight, Mac. Does anyone have any questions? I appreciate everyone's patience. I know this is a lot of information to unpack. Can reschedule exam appointment? Yes, but that requires either a cancellation charge or rescheduling fee, whatever the case is, and that's probably something that's administered through Pearson. Yes, so Zach brings up a good point. One of the features that you will have on the exam is a flag feature. So you'll be able to go out of your way and flag questions that maybe give you a little bit more difficulty. And then that way you either put them into two camps. I can solve this. It might take me a little bit of time, but I'm confident I can solve this. And this one, I think I know where to start. It's going to take me some time to unpack. And that's where a flag deserves of a flag. So do all the non-flags first and then go back to, what's flagged. So Matt, if you can clarify your question, I can look into it a little bit further. But we talked about a few different types of exposure to questions and how they're. I'm going to say that for right now, what the examinee guide doesn't necessarily speak on to the matter of when it gets what is opened up post submission. Effectively, what we have in terms of the scheduled break is after you do approximately half of the questions. But if you can articulate your salient point or inquiry, I can certainly look into it and get back to you. And Jose, for repeat takers, if I can suggest generically, I think it's just really intensively taking a look at what we did the last time around. Some of the things that I usually start off with for diagnostics is, okay, yes, obviously there was some technical gaps, right? So we maybe start off with a strategy of where do we have existing frameworks to build on and working out from that. And then secondly is what did we do or what did we didn't do last time? Are we okay with the 8 hours? So one of the things I'm asking, usually up front is how many 8-hour exam sessions did we do prior to the exam? More often than not, it's usually one or none. And so this isn't sufficient for saying that we're ready from an endurance perspective, because the endurance is going to compromise our ability to solve and solution mechanics. So if we can't effectively do it well for long, then it doesn't translate for the exam, and that can end up compromising, whatever effort that we had. So obviously making sure that we polished up everything from the diagnostic and that we've built on the existing understanding. So maybe we only, there was a few discrepancies, right? So there's a few things that we can read between the lines on diagnostic reports. Are we falling into false positives, right? So this is something that we didn't talk about at all in this class or in this session, but I will discuss in our technical classes, is the examiners utilize what we will say as false positives reports for questions, and that's where they delineate competency. So it's the omission of a parameter or the inclusion of a non-stated parameter, and that affects your calculation, and then you end up selecting it because that's what you saw on your calculator. And you think you got it right, but then you end up getting every single question wrong because you're falling into the trap, right? And that's how they distinguish the competent from non-competent from a calculatable perspective, right? It's not enough that we know the answer, know how to compute it, but we have to factor in all the associated parameters. And so that's one of the things that we want to be focused on outside of everything else that we mentioned. But any other specific advice or, one-on-ones, I welcome them, and we can take it from there. Okay, so Mac is explaining from his experience. Thank you, Mac. He's saying you won't have an opportunity to revisit the original 40, but once you get to the end of the 80, you'll have a chance to look at the overall 80. Thank you, Mac. And no worries. I know, listen, for what it's worth, all we're doing here in this process is trying to shave out any of the unknowns or the ambiguity and just making it all about just our performance day. So, I'm all for exhausting the devil in the details so we can be our best selves on exam day. And whether that's studying in the same kind of space that we'll be taking the exam room in, or using the same kind of resources and trying to mimic everything on exam day, I think that's really what's going to get us prepared. It's not about, okay, I got The Office playing in the background, I'm doing some questions, I'm snacking in the background, like I might not have access to my food as readily accessible. I'm getting up for bathroom breaks, more frequently than I would in exam day, or I have my playlist on my ears. These are comforts, unfortunately, that we're not going to have. And I think the more that we can edge up closer to that that realistic application is what's going to offer it, one-to-one translation of just our output. There seems to be, you're very welcome, Matt. I will stay on. This was a pilot program that we put together, thinking that it could answer a lot of these unknowns and things that go into the context of the exam. So, I go through this independently just because I think it's that much more important for just like technical exposure. We have to just also know the nature and the beast of the exam itself and what the examiners also believe. So if we have an opportunity to intersect again, we'll see this again a little bit more in our construction modules. But anyone that has any questions, please drop them in the chat. I won't be signing off until we clear those out. So, you're very welcome, Melissa. I recognize some of the names, some people that have already reached out to me. So, if you're ever going through the on-demand and you have any subject matter questions, just please feel free to also reach out as well. You have access to all of your instructors in the meantime for on-demand if you're registered for that as well. Yes, Mr. iPhone or Mrs. iPhone, if you are registered for on-demand, or if you just have general questions, feel free to forward them to info@schoolofpe, and then hopefully we can sort them out that way. Braden is asking a good question. He says, how many times do you think we should take an 8-hour exam? It's not necessarily an 8-hour exam. I think it's good to test for that, but we want to be able to finish before that. So this it's, can we finish 80 questions in a given sitting? And how many times would I recommend it before the actual exam? This is a loaded question, Braden. I want to be able to say as much as possible, but I know that that comes with burnout and there's a cost benefit to that. So before exam day, if we can carve that in 4 to 5 times, maybe 4 times, I think that would be great. And I could even drop that number down if we're getting in 6-hour time frames or we're getting 60 question blocks. It's kind of like maybe preparing for a marathon. I think the tempo, not that I'm experienced at all in this realm, but I think it's you do all your endurance training, or you'll do, the 15 or 12 mile or 18 mile, but then you'll save the 24, run for, marathon day. You're never going to do that before because there's some pain or some hurt that it's going to take a while to recover from. So maybe it's not that dramatic, but if we're doing all the background work, the 8 hours may be just symbolic. I think just being able to do the 60 to 80 questions without feeling burnt out is key. And not only just doing them and feeling refreshed, because I have people that are, I'll ask in the diagnostic conversation, they're repeat takers, and they're saying, I didn't have any issues with my time. And then I'll say, okay, so when we look at your diagnostic, there's a lot of areas of improvement. There's some topics that have 0, right, out of 6 questions. What happened there? Well, I thought I got them correctly. And usually that corresponds to we're not being astute on the question prompt. We're falling into false positives, things like that. And I think that's what we want to be able to, be cognizant of. It's not just about doing them. It's making sure we maintain laser focus in our execution and we're not falling into the common traps that the examiners have laid for us. Okay. Alberto is Alberto, maybe his question is how quantifying the study time before or outside of class. It's consistency for me. So it's it's every day after work, whether it's 2 or 3 hours. And then on the weekend, doubling that, whatever we can afford, because we're not working and we hopefully have a little bit more recharge. So getting into a good habit. And if we have an exam time block, I would also encourage working towards that exam time block. So if it starts at 7 a.m. on the weekend, I know this is going to be tough, but at least a month before, if we're taking off the Fridays, we're getting up at 6:30, 7, and we're working at that time because that's what the exam dictates. You're very welcome, Garrett. This is a two-part process, right? So I'm going to share the information from, what I have accessible to me from my experience and the awesome feedback that we get from our students and our candidates. And then the second part of it is just like us really owning this process and just making it that much more valuable. I think, maybe the differentiator for School of PE students and non-School of PE students is that our students tend to, heed the advice and the really motivated and enthused environment that we curate in the classrooms. So I just, I can't stress that enough. I think it's equally important. 5 full outs. I don't follow Molly. I don't full outs. I went over my head. Sorry. A pass score of 70%. So it changes every year. And I think on scoring, this is what we will say. What do the examiners say? There it is. It's a scaled score and it changes every year. Yeah. And if my general advice, and I know this is not something that is necessarily encouraging, but we don't want to aim for the average. We don't want to aim for the minimum. We aim for the minimum, we're going to fall short of it. Aim for whatever we can take. Aim for the highest bar that we can take. So there's no reason why we couldn't get 90% plus on the practice exam. This is a home field advantage. This is something that we're staring at for the next 3 months. So we have to be able to master it. When we talk about my confidence level as it correlates with candidates and their preparation, I'm going to say everybody on the board, everybody across the board, if they're given any ample amount of time to solve for any question, even outside of their subject matter expertise, can they do it? Yes, I have full faith they can do it. Why? I'm going to give you any amount of time. I'm going to give you all the resources, and you're going to be able to just reverse engineer, study it, just like we did independently in college or otherwise, and we're going to come up with a solution for it. And it's going to be, if I told you a month, you'd have overwhelming confidence. But this is not about, our latitudes and our comforts. This is about doing it on the basis of what the examiners established, an 8-hour time frame. Can we execute our competencies in the fashion that they expect for us, and really, swinging for the fences on this, right? Because it's about controlling what we can control, not playing by effectively what they've established as minimums. So what can we control? We can control how much time we dedicate. We can control how much exposure and how organized and how much commitment we put into this. And I think this is a fair process. I know this might be controversial. It's a fair process. We get in what we put, we get out what we put into it. And it's going to be one of the things I look back on this experience, and I will say wholeheartedly, there isn't much like it. This is pretty big in terms of how much is required to get us there. And hopefully, at least at the process, we can enjoy and look back on and reflect about, overcoming this, momentous, milestone, for lack of a better description. So, long story short, do what we can do and shoot for the stars on this. Jimmy is asking about how many times you can take it. The only maximum that we've seen established, and I think some of the respondents corroborated this, is it's 3 times per year. But as far as like overall, I've known candidates that have taken it, 6-7 times plus. I don't know if there's a cap to it in that regard. I think they just max out your exposure in a given time frame. Zach is asking a very good question, and maybe we didn't stress this enough. All of them are equal the same. So I think all the points are the same. We want to be able to get whatever points we can up front early and locked in as possible. There's no deductions for wrong answers. So if worse comes to worse and you're staring at the last 20 minutes of the exam and you have 5 questions, narrow them down and give a best guess. You don't lose anything in that. Okay. So, and we talked about my opinion about the scaled score perspective. So I'll leave it at that for now. And if anyone has any follow-up questions, they can certainly ask. Michael is asking a very good question, an excellent question. This is a very astute question. He said, why is the pass rate? And if anyone's still with us, and no one's, compelled to stay, we're just going through questions. So thank you all for staying this late. and this is all recorded, so if you want to catch the next 30 minutes, or I don't know how long we'll be here for, but, it'll be recorded for your use. Okay, why is there such a significant drop-off from the first time to the second time? It's almost like 20, 30% in some cases, right? This speaks back to maybe the misnomer or the misconception that we have that if we go in a second time or a third time, that the framework that we had is recyclable and can push us over the threshold. And that's incorrect. What it tells me from our first time being our best time is that the examiners have a minimum of expectancy from the candidates. And if we never hit that minimum, no amount of time or exposure of just taking the same tools that we built the first time is going to yield a productive result. So we have to get on their page in terms of what's needed and what we're doing to prepare for us to get there. And, attending today's session was one step in that direction, which is what do they identify as competent? And this exam is actually really designed for a 4-year testing group. It's a balance of, if I had to draw it, and this is maybe, one of the epiphanies that's coming to me as we're talking about this, is that, this is academia and practice. And they say that it's, it's 65% academia and 35% practice, in terms of engineering judgment, right? Like we hear that phrase, engineering judgment. And so we need a minimum tool set that is fashioned for this application of the exam to pass it. In its previous iterations, and if we're talking about transitions, the exam used to be 8 questions, just 8 questions, and each question was multi-part, and it was graded with partial credit by engineers. So when there was a design methodology, there was an approach, there was identifying parameters, and there was multi-steps to it, flow charts and everything that you could think of in between that, maybe something similar and tantamount to what we see in professional practice. But to scale it up for a larger market across the nation and the world, this would require enormous amounts of resource from the examiner side to be able to make it. And what we've lost in the process is what we would call an authentic assessment of competency, right? Multiple choice isn't an authentic assessment of competency. It's this definition, this slightly warped definition of what competent is from the examiner's perspective. And the only reason why I use the word warped in that maybe a little bit strong is because professional practice departures and deviates a little bit from what this exam actually represents. And that's where we see therein is the unfortunate circumstance that we have to contend with. But I think it makes it a little bit more attainable, that we can sharpen up specific tools for this, tackle it, and hopefully it represents a milestone for many more successful ones to come. Okay. You are very welcome, Zach and Jimmy. Okay. Molly's sharing. So how many times you can fail. Somebody had a more restrictive policy, determine the policy of the licensing board during the registration process. I don't know what the states may say or be able to offer in terms of restriction on the exam. They will have a policy on what the minimum is to be admitted into the board or to be evaluated by the board. But the examiners are the ones that determine their engagement or your engagement with the exam, right? So the boards will use whatever is populated, backfilled from the examiners, plus whatever references, plus whatever minimums that they require. And that all makes, a sufficient application, let's say. But that's neither here nor there. Maybe something for context as, we're gearing up for applications and stuff after the fact or before the fact, for that matter. Okay. Any other questions folks. Yeah, you're very welcome, everybody. I wish you all the best of luck. I know classes or courses are starting in a few weeks. I just say, going into it, just establish a timeline, find that commitment and the enthusiasm, and then stick to it and do what we can do. I think, the process is a short and an arduous one. It's going to feel long at times, but hopefully, with good investment of effort and time commitment, we'll have successful results. So thank you all for attending tonight. If anyone has any questions, I'll stick around, but you've been welcome to sign off, and please reach out to your respective instructors or myself if you have any subject matter questions, or info at School of PE for up-to-date information on courses and et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, you're very welcome, everyone. Have a great night.